everyone, and welcome to Day 2 of the iGEM. I am Elena Almeida from the British High Commission in Kuala Lumpur, and I will be your MC for this conference. Today, we will begin our journey in the topic of financing climate action, a 3-day series developed in partnership among Malaysia Green Tech and Climate Change Centre, Malaysia Green Business Council, and the British High Commission Kuala Lumpur. We are pleased to have you all here with us. On the first day of the Financing Climate Action series, we have lined up key local and international speakers to share their experience with us. To begin this series, please let me introduce our speaker who will provide opening remarks, Yang Bahagia Datuk Sri IR Dr. Zaini Ujang, Secretary General of the Ministry of Environment and Water. Datuk Sri IR Dr. Zaini Ujang is a national figure for his contributions as a public administrator, professional environmental engineer, academician, innovator, author, and environmentalist in Malaysia. We are lucky to have him here with us. So without further ado, please let me pass the floor to our honored speaker.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Tuan-tuan dan puan-puan yang dihormati sekalian. Terlebih dahulu bersyukur kita kehadirat Allah Subhanahu wa taala kerana dapat bersama dalam Financing Climate Action Forum 2020 sempena iGEM 2020. Ladies and gentlemen, for decades without us realizing, banks and the financial sector have been working hard to show and ensure that they can align their balance sheets with the greenhouse gas emissions targets. They also strive to enable customers to be climate resilient. Among the efforts is to ensure that the transition process can be handled fairly and inclusively. This could combine to form a fair transition challenge, a task that became even more important with the COVID-19 pandemic. Ladies and gentlemen, importantly, there is a crucial need for the financial institution to begin understanding climate change issues and start to mainstream it in their financing agenda. The financial institutions shall see that forging cooperation with the government sector on climate finance as an important agenda with huge opportunities. Malaysia is committed to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, together with other enduring commitments to address climate change issues under the Paris Agreement 2015 that had charted our green strategy to pursue green growth for the sustainability and resilience under the 11th Malaysian Plan 2016-2020. Ladies and gentlemen, as a vital Islamic finance hub, Malaysia launched the first green Islamic bond in the world in 2018, a new climate finance instrument that has the potential to channel the US 2 trillion Islamic finance market towards funding of green and sustainable investment projects. To complement and promote greater utilization of Green Sukuk as a fundraising channel, several incentives are in place to attract green issuers, including tax incentives for green technology activities in energy, transportation, building and waste management. The government had introduced financing incentives under the Green Technology Financing Scheme GTFS 2.0 with total funds allocation of Ringgit Malaysia 2 billion until 2020. The government and financial institutions must complement each other while the government plays an enabling role in developing climate change mitigation and adaptation policies. The financial institutions need to translate the policies into investment opportunities, conducting climate finance risk assessment, and developing the necessary climate finance action plan. In addition, the financial regulators and legislators play their role to provide support to financial institutions by comprehensively understand the dynamics of climate finance mechanism and conducting policy assessment to enable the climate finance transformation process. Ladies and gentlemen, there are various measures have been introduced or being mooted to be implemented to support the climate financing. For instance, the European Union just launched EU taxonomy regulation for Sustainability Activities and entered into force on 12 July 2020. It is a classification of economic activities or sectors that play key roles in climate change mitigation and adaptation. In this regard, I applaud under the formation of the Joint Committee on Climate Change, JC3 by the Bank Negara Malaysia and Securities Commission Malaysia to pursue collaborative actions building climate change resilience within the financial sector. Ladies and gentlemen, although we are only beginning to appreciate the costs associated with responding to climate change, additional financial resources will clearly be necessary at local and national levels for countries to build a climate resilient future. As such, climate change needs to be seen primarily as an economic concern that warrants attention. Towards a high-income country, Malaysia's ability to generate income and attract co-financiers and private investment should be mobilized. Ladies and gentlemen, while an immediate concern is given to develop funding strategies to secure private sector investment in mitigation actions that will reduce carbon emissions, large amount of expenditure is required to fund adaptation strategies, particularly to address the people's health and well-being. Ladies and gentlemen, the annual cost of adaptation is estimated will be between 140 to 300 USD billions by 2030, which suggests that public budgets will not be able to address the financing challenge alone. While focusing on public finance and believe it needs to flow efficiently first, private finance is also critical and also must materialize at scale in financing adaptation action. In this regard, Malaysia reiterates the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Under this principle, we need developed countries to take the lead in climate action while providing the means of implementation to the developing countries. Ladies and gentlemen, the government will deepen partnership and collaborative actions with key actors such as donors, investors, public and private banks, financial intermediaries, project developers, and implementers to develop, refine, and scale up innovative and successful mechanism of climate finance. Ladies and gentlemen, FCAC 2020 aims to bring together thought leaders, policymakers, financial practitioners, and relevant stakeholders to deliberate on pressing issues and develop a facilitating framework to foster climate finance. Ladies and gentlemen, the conference will also look upon a more proactive push by private and public financial institutions to create financial instruments for climate finance. These actions need also to be looked by a new strategies given the pandemic that we are now facing to ensure we build back better. I strongly believe this will bring a great impact on realizing the development of larger climate action financial facilities, especially in Malaysia, based on the commitment of speakers and financial institutions here. I wish you all a fruitful and rewarding conference at the first ever virtual iGEM. Although we are physically apart, I'm sure ideas and sharing of experiences still can be done through this robust virtual platform that we created for iGEM. Akhir kata, saya ucapkan setinggi-tinggi penghargaan kepada pihak MGTC, Malaysia Green Building Council, dan British High Commission Kuala Lumpur di atas usaha dan kerjasama dalam menjayakan Financing Climate Action Conference 2020. Sekian, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you.
Datuk Sri IR Dr. Zaini Ujang for your insights and for officially kicking off our Financing Climate Action Conference. Next, we will hear from two keynote speakers, Mr. Fazi Ali Ismail and Mr. Ken Oflaherty, before moving on to our panel session. I've had the pleasure of working with these two gentlemen and find that I always learn new perspectives from engaging with them. I hope you will as well.
Good morning, and thank you for the very kind introduction. To date, there is a genuine buzz in global climate action. The Paris Agreement, with 197 signatories, provides a pathway for nations to step up their climate mitigation and adaptation efforts. The UK, for example, is committed to a groundbreaking target of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. There is zero budget natural farming in Andhra Pradesh in India. There is the great pivot to natural farming in China. There is widespread adoption of electric buses in public transport urban fleets all over the world, including Malaysia. 72 central banks and supervisors around the world, including Malaysia, have come together via the Central Banks and Supervisors Network for Greening the Financial System, or NGFS, to pursue climate action. This coalition of the willing has initiated several initiatives such as identification of best practices on supervisory and microfinancial dimensions of climate-related risks. The issue is clearly now being mainstreamed in discussions at international and state levels, among regulatory agencies, at board levels across industries, in schools, and the list goes on. But while the hills are covered, there are mountains ahead. Green financing is still lacking. Green investments remain underfunded. Closer to this region, a recent report by the Asian Development Bank, or the ADB, highlighted that Southeast Asian countries require funding worth $3.1 trillion for climate-adjusted infrastructure in the region by 2030. In Malaysia, among other means, green financing is being rolled out through schemes such as the Green Technology Financing Schemes, or GTFS. Some institutions are allocating capital and steering financial flows towards more low-carbon, climate-resilient activities. However, considerable funding gaps remain. Public finance will likely to be inadequate for this task, and there is inevitably a need to draw in private capital. The renewable energy sector, for example, requires a total of 33.5 billion ringgit of funding by 2025 based on the projections provided by the Sustainable Energy Development Authority Malaysia, or SEDA. There is no ready panacea to the funding issues that we face. We need to understand the root cause to come up with possible solutions. In my view, one of the most critical issues is the mismatch in funding demand and supply and information asymmetry. Let me explain. We need to find a way to bridge the language and information gap between scientists, government, and financiers. What science says about climate effects, what climate action the government is prioritizing, what industries are providing and investing in, are quite incongruent at this point. While there is now greater demand for green financing, it is not matched by the supply side due to information gaps between financiers and green promoters. On the part of the financiers, it is crucial for financial institutions to build their capacity and capabilities to be able to better assess the viability of green projects, given the complexity and ever-evolving technology. Limited technical know-how on the part of the financial institutions on the green sector can lead to hesitation to provide funding or any form of protection or guarantees due to perceived risks. Limited financial literacy of project sponsors, such as corporates and micro, small, and medium enterprises, would also put them in a disadvantaged position in project evaluation. Many may also be unaware of the available financing instruments and suitable financing for their green ventures. Although Malaysia is a high-saving nation with high gross national savings averaging around above 20%, without addressing this, there will continue to be a mismatch between where the money sits and where it is needed for green investments. Green investments would continue to appear aspirational rather than a necessity. The pursuit of climate action including expanding climate finance, is one that calls for action from 4 key actors. First, the government. Second, businesses. Third, the NGOs and civil societies. And finally, the financial sector. Businesses need to pay attention to the environment. Simply put, there can be no profit without the planet. The NGOs and civil societies could play diverse roles in support of climate agenda, including creating deep awareness and highlighting problems. Today, I would like to speak more on the roles of the government and the financial sector. First, the government. The roles of government to lead, convene, set standards, invest, educate, and champion are all quite obvious. The government plays a leading role in setting the stage for the nation's climate agenda. These includes setting the national targets for green projects according to identified priority sectors, as well as the financing needs and technical information. It is important for this information to be available publicly to create the requisite awareness for mobilization of green finance. Moving forward, the push for disclosure through the establishment of National Framework for Carbon Emissions Reporting is another critical enabler to increase data availability and transparency for a systemic transition to a low-carbon economy. This will contribute towards the development of a more data-driven climate policies and targeted carbon emissions reduction schemes. Second is the role of finance. We have spoken about the critical need to bring in private capital for green investment. Bank Negara, as financial regulator, recognizes this role of finance and has introduced various measures towards this end. Given physical, transition, and liability risks and their implication to the economy and financial system, there is a bona fide recognition that climate risk is well within our mandate of safeguarding monetary and financial stability. With that, the bank has taken a phased and proactive approach in strengthening financial system, resilience to climate risk, and in driving sustainable finance. In this connection, guidance for financial institutions to classify economic activities that can contribute to climate change objectives is provided through our work in developing a principles-based taxonomy. This will be the start to build a deeper understanding in climate risks for financial institutions to better identify, assess, and manage the risk. The bank is now working to finalize the climate change and principles-based taxonomy, which is expected for issuance next year. The bank also collaborates with the financial industry to accelerate initiatives to build the required capacity and expertise relating to green and sustainability. Through Value-Based Intermediation Community of Practitioners, or VBI Corp, various guidance documents have been developed to spur adoption of VBI, which considers the triple bottom line of people, planet, and prosperity. In August this year, Value-Based Intermediation Financing and Investment Impact Assessment Framework, VBIAF, sectoral guides on palm oil, renewable energy, and energy efficiency were issued to guide financial institutions in implementing VBIAF on these sectors at a more granular and transactional level. Work is also in progress to develop the next VBIAF sectoral guides on manufacturing, oil and gas, infrastructure and construction, which are all targeted for issuance in 2021. Furthermore, greater climate disclosure by financial institutions is in the pipeline as we are progressing plans to further encourage financial institutions to adopt the TCFD recommendations for climate-related exposure. This is part of the priorities of the members of the Joint Policy on Climate Change over the next 12 months to pave the way for the adoption of disclosure standards by the industry in the immediate future. This will not only contribute towards lowering information asymmetry, but will also assist external stakeholders to hold financial institutions to account for their climate risk commitments. Ladies and gentlemen, the capital market can play a critical role to address the financing gaps not only in green but social and sustainable sectors. The SRI roadmap for the Malaysian capital market issued in November last year aims to create a facilitative SRI ecosystem and chart the role of the capital market in driving Malaysia's sustainable development. The Sukuk market, which is a high-growth segment in Islamic finance, has an important role in supporting the growth of the green technology sector. Malaysia continues to be at the forefront of green Sukuk, which is the preferred mode of investment for those that prefer investments with a positive environmental impact. We can certainly tap into the Sukuk market to fund activities or technologies that support a low-carbon and climate-resilient society. Ladies and gentlemen, I am not asking us to reinvent capitalism at this conference. There is simply not enough time for that if we are to meet our Paris Agreement commitment. What I am asking is for us to harness the best parts of capitalism and to use it to tackle what is the biggest challenge of our generation. I certainly hope that our conversations today will help us better understand the issues at hand and inspire us to find better financial solutions. Let us find ways to green the financial system and subsequently finance the green. Finally, earlier I spoke about the key players in tackling the climate change, namely the government, NGOs, business sectors, and the financial sector. I have left the most important one, which is the individuals. Change can only come if we start with ourselves. We ought to start with small personal change, which is to lower our personal carbon footprint. By itself, it might be small in terms of emission. Importantly, however, it will initiate a deeper realization, stoke more passion for the issue, catalyze deeper and more engaged conversations with others, and hopefully create more momentum for systems level change that we all aspire to see. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Farzi Ali, for sharing your viewpoints with us and setting the tone for Financing Climate Action Conference. It is clear that there is still some ways to go to achieve a vibrant green finance system in Malaysia, not least because we still need to address key issues like the funding mismatch between demand and supply and the information asymmetry. But I have to note that we are making progress. As pointed out by Mr. Farzi Ali, the approach must be partnership, not just between government, financial sector, and businesses, but civil society and all of us as individuals. Our second keynote speaker today is Mr. Can Oflaherty, the UK government's COP26 regional ambassador to Asia Pacific and South Asia. As the COP26 regional ambassador for this region, Mr. Can Oflaherty has been involved in numerous policy discussions with senior business and government stakeholders on catalyzing climate action. A career diplomat, he has experience in a number of foreign office departments, as well as overseas roles in Paris, Tokyo, and the UK representation to the European Union. Mr. Ken has worked on a range of issues, including economic and energy issues in various parts of the world. Please let me welcome Mr. Can Oflaherty onto the platform.
Hello, my name is Ken Oflaherty and I have the honour to be the COP26 Regional Ambassador for the Asia Pacific region. I'm very pleased to be speaking at this webinar, jointly organised by the Malaysian Green Technology and Climate Change Centre in partnership with the British High Commission in Kuala Lumpur and the Malaysian Green Building Council. Leaders from across the world will travel to Glasgow in November next year to attend the COP26 Summit on climate change. Delivering a successful COP26 summit is a top priority for the UK government. We want the event to mark a clear step forward in global efforts to drive down emissions and tackle the impact of climate change. Governments across the world continue to tackle the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has devastated economies and societies in recent months. We are rightly focused on caring and curing. But in our response, we also need to consider the crucial challenge of climate change, which has even greater potential to devastate lives across the world in the longer or even medium term. Countries across Asia are already facing the impacts of destructive extreme weather events, and the frequency of such events is set to accelerate in the years ahead. So our collective recovery needs strong roots in a greener and more resilient global economy. The challenges, as you know, are enormous. You will also know how those challenges are multiplied for the most vulnerable communities, suffering the double burden of COVID-19 and the impacts of climate change. So as countries recover from the pandemic, this is also an opportunity to build back better and to lay the foundations for sustainable and inclusive growth. Collective international action is crucial. The UK will lead work on recovering better for sustainability at the request of the UN Secretary-General. Specifically, we need developed countries to fulfil their commitment to $100 billion in annual climate finance from 2020. The UK has committed to double our international climate finance to over £11 billion between 2021 and 2025. We are pressing international donors to follow our lead. ICF money has been challenged into this region, and it will continue to be scaled up further across Asia. We should increase the availability of finance for adaptation and resilience. At the same time, we need action to improve the effectiveness of these investments. More finance needs to flow into low-carbon investments. We need to build new public-private partnerships. We need a pipeline of projects and market structures to increase sustainable private finance to developing countries. And we need better reporting of climate risk, with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures becoming the standard. Using public finance effectively is key, finding new ways to mobilise and channel capital to the countries, sectors and projects that need it. Our shared efforts through the Green Climate Fund, alongside other partners, can play a key role in this. The fund is already helping much-needed projects in over 100 countries, including in Malaysia and the wider Southeast Asia region. Last year, the fund raised nearly $10 billion in its first replenishment, so it is well resourced to do more. The UK's pledge of over £1.4 billion makes us the largest contributor to the fund and shows the value and importance we place on multilateralism and working together through our shared global institutions. This is even more important as we face the twin global challenges of COVID and climate change. Next month, the Lord Mayor of London will host the Green Horizons Summit on the pivotal role that finance plays in a green recovery and an economy-wide transition to net zero. I hope this occasion will see the global financial community coming together to collectively play its part in the fight against climate change. These are extraordinary times. We now need our resources to go even further than before. Working together, we need to mobilise more investment from the multilateral development banks and from the private sector in support of our shared goals. We need this to achieve a green recovery and deliver on our commitments made in Paris. Achieving net zero requires the whole economy, every company, every bank, every insurer, every investor to change the way they operate. Recently, the Malaysian bank CIMB announced the positive news that it is developing a coal policy and stated this coal guideline will be available by the end of this year or early 2021. This will be a first for Malaysian banks. I look forward to understanding the content of that emerging policy. We want to use the opportunity of COP26 to visibly move finance into low carbon and resilient investment that maximises overall environmental benefits. We must show developing countries that finance will flow to sustainably support their economic growth. There are already welcome market signals that governments and investors are starting to take the action required. Global green bond issuance climbed by nearly 50% to a record high of almost $255 billion in 2019. The recent announcement by China that it will achieve carbon neutrality by 2060 is welcome, and implies it will invest even faster and in greater volumes in renewable energy. This in turn will further drive down the costs of such technologies across Asia. But we need to work together to step up this progress. For a 1.5 degrees Celsius trajectory, annual average investments in low-carbon energy technologies and energy efficiency need to be upscaled by roughly a factor of 6 by 2050 compared to 2015, overtaking investment in fossil fuels globally by around 2025. The International Energy Agency has estimated that $13.5 trillion of public and private investment in the global energy sector alone will be required between 2015 and 2030 to meet Paris targets. At least $6 trillion every year of new or reallocated infrastructure investment up to 2030 will also be required to meet the Paris Agreement and the wider Sustainable Development Goals. An estimated $163 billion of assets are underinsured in the world today, with emerging economies accounting for 96% of the global total. And a report from Ricardo Energy and Environment, prepared for the UK Committee on Climate Change, estimated that the potential global market size for low-carbon financial services could reach £280 billion each year in 2030 and £460 billion by 2050. The UK is ready to be bold and ambitious in partnership with all of you ahead of what we hope will be a pivotal COP26 in Glasgow. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken, for those insights. Indeed, studies have shown that renewable energy can have positive impacts on growth, economy, and health. And now, costs for renewable energy is becoming more competitive to coal in almost every country in the world, including Malaysia. If we ignore this and continue to invest in coal, we may face the risk, or rather the certainty, of stranded assets. Our keynote speakers have outlined the clear case of direction of travel toward green finance and investment in renewable energy. The juxtaposition of these elements is core to our conference topic for today, financing climate action. Let's keep these perspectives in mind as we move on to the panel session. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind you to ask the panelists a lot of questions. If panelists are not able to revert to you today, rest assured we will get a response via email. Now, without further ado, let's begin the panel session portion of the conference. Allow me to pass the floor over to Mr. Ahmad Hafiz bin Abdul Aziz, Senior Financial Sector Specialist at the World Bank, to introduce members of our panel. I wish you all a productive session ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. I'm Hafiz from the World Bank Malaysia. First of all, I would like to thank you very much to the organizer for inviting World Bank to moderate for these sessions. So we have with us three very respectable speakers. So I think before we start our panel discussion, let me briefly introduce for each speaker. So the first speaker we have Mr. Leo Hyong Kun Park. So Mr. Leo is managing the financial institutions team within the Green Climate Funds. He will be leading the GCF Sustainability Initiative, which aims to make GCF internal operation more sustainable on a voluntary basis. The GCF is a fund within the framework of the UNFCCC, founded as a mechanism to redistribute money from the developed to the developing world. In order to assist the developing countries in adaptation and mitigation practices to counter climate change, the GCF is based in South Korea. Mr. Leo also received an honor award from Minister and for Environmental Excellence and also award from the Deputy Prime Minister. The second speaker is our Mr. Jonathan Cooney. Mr. Jonathan Cooney is a senior climate finance specialist in the climate change division of the World Bank. He co-leads the bank efforts to design principles for transformative climate finance and advise on carbon finance trust fund program. Previously, Mr. Jonathan was a global lead for green competitiveness at the World Bank, where he helped grow the organization's support for private sectors in climate-related market to 195 million in lending project and technical assistance. He also served as a program coordinator of the World Bank Climate Technology Program, which under his leadership grew from ideation to 90 million, a global network of 8 climate innovation centers that support local companies to grow their clean technology businesses. Prior to joining the World Bank, Jonathan worked at the International Energy Agencies, where he published 9 books of energy policy, and earlier in his career, Jonathan structured project finance for power plants and developed and marketed a clean cooling technology for the Caribbean. Jonathan holds an MBA from INSEAD France and Master in Bachelor degree in Engineering from Brown University and has 2 US patents in clean energy technology. Our third speaker is Mr. Russell March. Russell March is a skilled policy analyst, advocate, and communicator with 20 years experience in the policy and politics of climate change and energy. He also an expert knowledge of Australian, UK, EU, and international climate and energy policy, skilled project manager with experience of writing project proposal, securing funding, and delivery outcome. We have a 3 very good speaker here. I think let's hear from our speaker. Let's start with the first speaker, Mr. Leo. Mr. Leo, the floor is yours.
Island developing countries, least developed countries, as well as African states. Why? Because these regions and countries are most vulnerable to climate change. GCF can fund both public and private sector projects, and we have 3 funding windows to do that, which include readiness support, project preparation facility, and funding proposal. And the next slide shows the GCF portfolio. So like I said, we have a project totaling about 6.2 billion US dollars of commitment from the GCF, covering 106 countries. And we have readiness program approved, totaling $258 million, covering 138 countries. And if you include all the co-financing, the total portfolio is around 21 billion US dollars, which expect to reduce around 1 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions and help 394 million people with increased resilience. And you can also see the regional breakdown. GCF is quite a unique institution based on the business model we have adopted. So we do not actually fund the projects directly by ourselves, but we channel our funding through our accredited entity. And this chart shows the accredited entities that we have around the world, and they expect to grow. So we have both entities that have been accredited internationally, such as multilateral development banks and UN organizations, or commercial banks who have global coverage. But we also have so-called direct access entities that are essentially local entities that include, for example, national development banks or even the ministries themselves. So they bring the funding proposal to the GCF, and once they are approved by our board, our funding can be channeled to projects and programs. And the financial instruments that we can deploy include grants, loans, guarantees, and equity. And it's very, very important to make sure that our country counterparty, which are called the national designated authorities or focal points, are fully on board. So, for example, without their non-objection letters issued for any particular project, GCF will not be able to approve any funding proposal submitted by the accredited entities. A little bit about our GCF private sector facility, the division to which I belong. And this slide shows our mandate. We basically aim to support private sector operations to finance climate change again mitigation and adaptation projects by de-risking the delivery of capital flows from the private sector, and then we can do it by providing very flexible instruments and terms, and we are willing to take the risk that nobody else can. And this chart shows the GCF private sector facilities portfolio as well as the co-financing amount. So PSF, for example, have now committed around $2 billion of US dollars. And if you look at the instruments, the majority of our financing are in the form of loans and equities. And we, of course, provide grants in the form of, for example, technical assistance and capacity building, in addition to the non-grant instruments that we can deploy. And mobilizing private sector investment is very, very important mandate of the PSF. And as of now, we have managed to bring around 3.5 times co-financing, both from the private sector as well as the public sector investors. And the PSF portfolio, again, as you can see, some of the examples, etc., that covers, almost all the continents. So with the 26 projects approved and 1.9 billion financing from the GCF, we managed to again mobilize around 6.7 billion US dollars that expect to reduce 0.3 gigatons of CO2 emissions and to help 46 million beneficiaries across target countries. Let me now move to GCF readiness program that could be of interest to the policymakers here, especially. So we have a green finance readiness program. I mean, this is not a separate brand, but because there are now namely 5 components under the readiness program, and we do believe that this green finance related readiness program can go under the development of strategic framework, which is the second pillar of the readiness program. I'm mentioning this because our team, especially the financial institutions team within the private sector facility, we aspire to support countries that are interested in greening their financial system. So we can partner with entities like IFC Sustainable Banking Network or UNFFI, ZIZE, central banks, local banking associations, and other partners such as AFI, Alliance for Financial Inclusion, based in Kuala Lumpur, to be our readiness delivery partner that can help, again, government stakeholders such as national designated authority, financial regulators, ministries, central banks, etc., in their efforts to the greening the financial system. The next slide shows some examples, what kind of green finance readiness programs that we can support. So in Bangladesh, for example, we are partnering with the Bangladesh Bank, which is a central bank of Bangladesh, to merge Islamic finance concept together with the green finance concept for the country. And in Jamaica, we are now supporting the country to create a green bond listing because they have ambition to become the exchange, there's like a sustainable exchange for the region in Caribbean. Other examples can also include creation of a green finance institution. So in Cambodia, we have provided funding to do a scoping study to see whether we can set up a green financing vehicle for the country, and we have done the similar project in Mongolia as well. And I'd like to invite the participants to visit our website to take a look at our financial institutions publication, which was launched last year, because it does show all the interesting case studies on how GCF have used the funding proposal or project preparation facility and readiness with an aim to transform the financial system, and it is available in English, French, and Spanish. So the lessons learned. So what we have learned so far is that, of course, it's very important for us to explore new financing or business models to help countries meet their NDC targets as well as the Paris Agreement goals. And we do believe that it is very important to engage with the various stakeholders, right, ranging from public to private sector, as well as domestic and international financial resources. And we want to make sure that we provide some of the policy level support to create an enabling environment, or if needed, create a regulatory frameworks that can steer the investments to be more sustainable and aligned with the Paris Agreement goals. And we'd like to collaborate with the countries, again, to help them to be further engaged with their international green financing initiatives, such as Network for Greening the Financial System, as well as Task Force on Climate Financial Disclosure. And we'd like to bring key financial institutions in the country for accreditation, or help them partner with the existing accredited entities to bring project forward. And GCF, we are fully aware that countries are suffering from the COVID-19, and we try to explore the ways we can help these countries to promote green resilient recovery from COVID-19. And we have now adopted 3 prolonged approach, which include allowing increased time and repayment flexibility to countries implementing GCF projects. And we can consider deploying much needed concessional funding. And we can provide through the readiness program the capacity building support of the policymakers to promote green resilient recovery in their countries. So how can GCF further engage with Malaysia? As you may know, so we have 2 readiness programs in Malaysia that have been approved. One is with the Carbon Trust, a UK-based entity, who have brought forward the project focuses on the NDA strengthening and developing country programming support for the country, which was approved back in October 2017. And we have a second readiness project approved with the UNEP this time that focuses on the implementation of the 3rd phase of RED Plus in the country. And this slide shows some of the ideas on how GCF can further, again, more actively engage with Malaysia. So we strongly believe that Malaysia, especially compared to other developing countries, has a very solid regulatory framework and policies that can help encourage more green investments. For example, we are aware that the Central Bank of Malaysia, BNM, is trying to develop the green taxonomy. And also the Capital Markets Malaysia have launched the Malaysian Sustainable Finance Initiative. So these type of activities can be further supported through the GCF Readiness Program. And GCF can also provide readiness support to help local entities get accredited to the GCF. So for example, Malaysia Green Technology and Climate Change Center and Malaysian Development Bank can come forward and apply for the accreditation. Of course, we can consider other private sector institutions as well, such as commercial banks in Malaysia, as we have cases, for example, in Mongolia and others. And for funding proposal, GCF can provide a very concessional long-term green financing, and we can also offer some kind of risk-sharing tools. Through our project preparation facility, we can provide technical support for market assessment, studies, and design of funding proposal that ultimately can help meet the GCF investment criteria. And we can take a more holistic approach by utilizing both readiness, PPF, and the funding proposal, which can be again used to create a green investment bank or transform an existing institution such as MGTC into a green investment bank. And let me show how we can do it. So this is one example in Mongolia, where we are trying to set up a Mongolia Green Finance Corporation. And we started with the readiness program with the GGGI back in 2017 to early 2019. And this readiness funding was used to conduct a scoping study to find out the right structure, legal due diligence, and business model, etc. But we still saw some gaps, and that's when we offered project preparation support to Hasbank this time as our accredited entity, and they hired Macquarie Green Investment Group as a consultant to develop like guidelines for governance structure, capitalization strategy, etc. And once we laid out the foundation, now Hasbank has submitted a funding proposal that will be going to our board for consideration next month. So once this project is established and Mongolian Green Finance Corporation becomes up and running, this will actually be a first dedicated green investment bank in developing country with a very unique capitalization coming from both public, private, as well as international organization like GCF. And this is a model that we can, for example, explore replicating in Malaysia if you're interested in creating a new institution or again transforming an existing institution into a green investment bank. So this is the end of my presentation. So you can find out my contact details here. So please feel free to reach out to me anytime if you have any questions. I know we don't have a dedicated Q&A session today, but again, I'll be more than happy to address your questions over email. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Leo, for sharing with us on GCF and how Malaysia can tap for the Green Climate Fund. So I think let's move to our second speaker, Mr. Jonathan. So Mr. Jonathan will share with us how international climate funds best support low emission and climate resilient development. So with that, Mr. Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Mr. Jonathan.
I'm afraid I can't start my video because the host has stopped it, but I would like to start that if possible. Again, I'm just trying to start my video here so I can show you the presentation. It seems to be stopped.
Can you switch on your camera, Mr. Jonathan?
I'm trying to start the video, but it says I cannot start the video because the host has stopped it. Keep trying this. Unfortunately, it's not working. Share screen. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Well, let me just go ahead in the interest of time to give you the presentation. Unfortunately, you won't be able to see my smiling face until I can get this going. But let me just go ahead again in the interest of time. As was mentioned, my name is Jonathan Cooney, and I work at the World Bank in the Climate Change Group Funds Management Unit. I first wanted to thank the organizers of the event for inviting me to speak. It looks like a very, very interesting event, and I hope what I have to share with you today is of use to you. And I myself look forward to the interaction and hearing your responses and your experiences as well. Today, I'm going to speak to you about how international climate funds can best support low emission and climate resilient development. In June of this year, just a couple months ago, the World Bank released a report on transformative climate finance, which very much addresses this topic. So I'll be drawing from the analysis and conclusions of that report, and also explaining a little bit of the directions we're going now going forward. Okay, going to the next one here. Oops, there we go. The basis of our analysis and what I wanted to say to you today is that the available international climate finance is insufficient to meet the needs of developing countries. If you look all the way over to the left, you see annual dedicated climate finance. This is finance that comes at concessional rates or even grant and prioritizes climate change needs. And that's the kind of money we just heard from Mr. Park that GCF provides. The CIF, Climate Investment Funds, also provides it. And that's roughly $3 billion a year. The middle button there, the middle dot, is annual climate-related development finance. And that comes from the MDBs, both the World Bank and the regional development banks, lent to countries for projects that have climate benefits. And that's about $55 billion. In fact, the numbers have increased because a new report just came out, but it's roughly the same. So if you put the $55 billion together with the $3 billion, you get about $60 billion. But way over to the right are the annual investment needs for developing countries to achieve low carbon, climate resilient development. And that's 4,000 billion or 4 trillion. So even with very impressive leveraging rates, we just heard from Mr. Park that GCF can achieve about 3.5 times leverage, which I think is better than the World Bank does. You're still not that close to this $4 trillion need. So the answer to this problem, two things you do. One is you increase the amount of financing going to developing countries, the 3 billion and the 50 billion, 55 billion, you increase that, but it will not realistically reach $4 trillion. And therefore you need to spend the money that you have available in much more catalytic and transformative ways than it's been spent before. So what exactly does that mean? Climate transformation. I've been working in clean energy and climate change for many years. Every project I've ever worked on called itself transformative. We're transforming this, we're transforming that. So you have to be very specific how your climate finance projects do achieve actual transformation. And we looked at a number of projects and came up with these 5 different ways. One is technology. If you do a project that decreases the price of the technology below competing brown technologies, you will, of course, have a highly catalytic effect. Policy development and implementation. Policy is a hugely effective tool for leveraging the small amount of money to catalyze other action. And the third one is institutional or technical capacity. Sure, everyone wants to do climate change in the government, in the banks, and so forth, but the knowledge and the capacity, the systems are not there. Building that is hugely catalytic. Fourth, knowledge creation and dissemination. This is fairly obvious. And fifth, having a demonstration effect. So doing a project that when you demonstrate it works, whether it's a technology or a policy, other people from around the country, around the globe will look at it and say, okay, I can do that too. That's highly catalytic as well. So realizing we needed to find ways to be more transformative and more catalytic in the way I've just described, we looked at a taxonomy, or we created a taxonomy of how climate finance can be spent. And we created 8 different climate finance modalities, what we call climate levers for transformative action, to see how each of them would rate in terms of creating this incredible catalytic effect that we need. The first one is probably the most well-known, in a way the simplest, certainly the most well-known, that's project-based financing. You take money from the GCF, you pair it with money from Asian Development Bank, and you build a wind farm, for example, or a climate resilient road. The second is using your money for financial sector reform. Again, we heard from Mr. Park on how that's being done in Malaysia and elsewhere. The third is fiscal policies. Primarily, this is eliminating fossil fuel subsidies and or creating carbon taxes, but also includes other government spending priorities and green procurement to have a leveraging effect. The fourth are sector priorities or sector regulations. A good example of that is changing regulations on grid operation for electric grids, electric utilities, so that they can accept rather than reject intermittent renewable energy. The fifth way you can drive climate action is through trade policy, very interesting area. The sixth is innovation and technology transfer. This is one that a lot of people put a lot of faith into, and I'm one of those people. When you look what's happened with solar panels, the money that's gone into innovating solar panels and transferring that technologies to developing countries has achieved a remarkable increase in the value and decrease in the price, such that private sector is now coming in with no need for any further public support. So if you can repeat that in other areas, the catalytic impact you have is tremendous. The seventh is carbon markets, which is a system seeing a checkered history, I would say, but now sort of coming back with the European ETS, emission trading system, reviving. Is a very interesting way to get additional climate finance into your country. And then the eighth is climate intelligence and data. So for each of these 8 climate levers, we looked at how international public climate finance could be spent in them, what barriers it overcame when it was spent, and then ultimately what the leveraging effect was. So the reports that we did had, excuse me a second, the reports that we did, sorry about that. The report that we did, and I'll cite to it later, has deep dives into each of these, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into the results of each of these and how climate finance can be spent catalytically for each of these. And instead, I'm going to talk about some of the high level, the primary findings that cut across all of these levers and provide a set of principles on how you can spend your climate finance in a more catalytic way to drive clean development. The first is plan for the long term. It's very common for any climate project to focus on short-term results. All the stakeholders want short-term results. The funders do, the implementers do, like the MDBs. Certainly the recipient countries do. If they're politicians, they want to point to the results they had. However, this can often be at odds with a long-term strategy for true low carbon resilient development. A lot of countries are now developing long-term strategies, LTSs for climate, and the World Bank is helping them. If you don't have such a strategy or use your NDC to sort of set these long-term goals, you're going to just do short-term after short-term after short-term, and you really never get those long-term transformation that you want. The second finding is to balance allocation among the levers. Remember here, the first lever is the project-based financing. Everyone knows what that is. That's been a majority of spending for climate finance to date. Those things are great. It's great to have a wind farm. It's great to have climate resilient infrastructure. However, that needs to be augmented with more spending in the other areas and hopefully done in a coordinated fashion so that the power of the project-based spending is leveraged through these other levers. The third major finding is to expand the use of instruments, expand the use of financial instruments for the funding available. Since the primary use of climate finance is project-based infrastructure, you use investment finance. Again, there's nothing wrong with that, but we found in looking at these 8 levers and going into a deep dive into the theory and examples that there were many cases where other financial instruments had more leveraging effect. Policy-based financing is a very powerful tool. Results-based financing is very motivating in itself. Equity finance, which you can consider that investment finance, but could go into companies at an earlier stage, and guarantees. So there's nothing wrong with the basic use of climate finance for investment finance, but using it in other financial instruments together has a much more catalytic effect. And finally, the fourth and final major finding of our analysis is you have to look at leveraging beyond the project boundaries. Every project does leveraging. We did this and these other people came in. It's normal, it's natural, but that's very rarely done beyond the project boundaries. And the fact is, climate change is not going to be solved on a project by project basis. It's a problem that infiltrates the entire economy, the entire society. So it has to be addressed with solutions that also go through your entire economy. So it's very natural for a project developer to just care about their project. They should be forced to develop a methodology that looks at the impacts beyond their project boundaries. So I mentioned the release of this report in June. I'm not sure if you all can find this here, see this here, or you can just reach out to me. You can find it on the website. There's a lot of information here on each of these levers and how to use them in different circumstances. So I encourage you to to try to find them or contact me, I'm happy to send them to you. But I wanted to close with where we're going now. We finished this report and published it in June, had a launch event in combination with I4C, Innovation for Climate. Now we're drilling down and applying the principles we developed on transformative climate finance to selected countries to maximize the volume of international funding that they can get for climate and the impact of that funding. We're talking to the government of Costa Rica to do a country climate finance diagnostic there, and we should be starting before the end of the calendar year. We may go to other countries as well, but we're going to start with Costa Rica. And the way this works is the first step is to determine what the long-term strategic goals of the country are. Many countries already have a long-term strategy. Costa Rica does. Other countries have strong NDCs, which map out to 2030 where the country needs to go. And from that long-term strategy, determine what steps are needed to get there. You have a target in 2030, you have a target in 2050. What are the interim steps needed to get there? And map that out and map out the costs. Then in the second step of the country climate finance diagnostic, you see which of the levers are most suited to catalyze the money to achieve those steps to get to the long-term goals. So looking at how fiscal policies can be amended to raise financing for some of the interim goals, looking at how innovation is needed to develop technologies or technology capacity in the country to develop those long-term goals. And then finally, this third step is to combine the first two and put together a comprehensive climate finance strategy for the country that presents to them and to donors as well how they can effectively use climate finance in an aggregate package. We think this will be compelling to the donors who constantly express frustration of taking things in a piecemeal fashion. Of course, they want to do that as well because they got to get their money out the door also, and they want a project with their stamp on it. No matter what the donor is, and I'm not saying this in a negative way, of course they want to do it. If a country has a comprehensive climate finance strategy to represent to the donor community, then they're going to be in a much better position to raise money, and that money will be in a position or available, programmed in a way that has a much better impact for development of the country, because certainly economic development is a factor, but done in a decarbonized and climate resilient way. So I'm going to stop right there. I have my coordinates on this slide, or you can just Google me if you want. Very happy to hear feedback. And as I say, those reports are also on the web. So with that, I'll stop. And again, thank you very much for your time. And thank you very much for the organizers of this event. It's really a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jonathan. So Mr. Jonathan shared with us on the transformative climate finance, how the country need to align the long-term strategy to ensure that we meet the long-term target, because after the Paris Climate Agreement, we have NDC, a lot of the long-term target to ensure that we meet the climate target. Mr. Jonathan, I think you can wait for Q&A or not right? Okay, thank you.
Yes, I'll wait. Look forward to that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, like our MC shared earlier, if you have any question, you can use a chat box. You can post your question here. So we will try to answer your questions. So we go to the third speaker, Mr. Russell. So Mr. Russell will share a little bit on the growth of sustainable finance with the latest development, what's happened within the sustainable finance framework. So we pass the session to Mr. Russell. Mr. Russell, the floor is yours.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here this morning. Thanks to the organisers for inviting me to speak this morning. I'm really pleased to be involved in this conference. Obviously, would have loved to have been in Malaysia today to be able to present this presentation directly, but obviously that's not possible at the moment. but I am really pleased to be here and looking forward to my presentation and for any questions we might get throughout this morning. So a little bit about myself. Hafiz just introduced me a bit. I've got about 20 years experience now of working on carbon, renewable energy and finance, and I've done that across the globe. Started in the UK, worked in Australia, and now in Singapore, working across ASEAN. And at the moment, I'm working at EY in Singapore, but we're leading a program for the UK government. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about this morning is based on work we are doing for the UK government as part of their what we call the ASEAN Low Carbon Energy Program, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And I'm going to take a slightly different track to the previous speakers. I'm going to look a little bit about the opportunities presented by the need to transition to a low carbon economy, and particularly low carbon energy, and then talk a little bit about some of the products that are emerging to help support that. We've been working on this program for the UK government for over a year now, and we've seen new products and financial products emerge into the market. And it's one of the questions we get asked a lot is from people trying to understand the difference between these different products, and particularly these new ones, how they operate. And I'll focus a little bit on what those new products are. So I'm saying quickly at a high level, just a bit about the program that I lead for the UK government and is the basis on which I'm doing this presentation today. And as I said, it's called the ASEAN Low Carbon Energy Program. And as outlined on the slide, it aims to support the shift towards low carbon energy in ASEAN. It's a £15 million program of overseas development spending by the UK government, and is focusing on two areas as outlined on this slide. So one is green finance and the other is energy efficiency. And we provide a range of support in those two areas as outlined. And again, we're working in 6 countries directly in ASEAN, again, as listed in the slide, including Malaysia. And as I said, we've been working on this program now for over a year. We started back in March last year with the inception phase, spent a lot of time talking to stakeholders in the countries we're working in and developing the program of work, which was agreed by the UK government at the end of September last year. And so since then, we've been in implementation phase. So being in implementation phase for about a year, working across those countries. And I should highlight that it's not just EY that's working on this program. We're working with a number of other partners, in particular, the Carbon Trust, who lead on the energy efficiency work stream. I lead, and EY leads on the green finance work stream, and I sit in Singapore and lead that across the 6 countries. And the Carbon Trust lead the energy efficiency work stream. We're also working with a development organization called IMC to make sure that everything we do meets both ODA requirements, but is also very strongly focused on gender and inclusion. So just quickly, a couple of things we're doing in Malaysia under the program, and a couple of these initiatives have been mentioned already. So we're working with Capital Markets Malaysia on the establishment of what's called the Malaysia Sustainable Finance Initiative. Some of you on the call may already have had some engagement with that, and so we're providing ongoing support, including a series of workshops and roundtables that will be rolled out over the course of the next 12 months or so. Then the other one is working with Bank Negara and with the JC3 on capacity building for a range of stakeholders on sustainable finance and climate risk. And we've already done one series of webinars, and say that you have a snapshot of the program on the slide there. And then we're also looking again to continue rolling out some of those workshops over the course of the remaining of the course of the program up until March 2022. So moving on to what I wanted to talk about. So this is really about looking at, again, what's the opportunity, and then again, some of the emerging products that are on the market to help finance the transition. So often when we start talking about climate, people and financial sector, people talk about climate risk, and people talk about the challenge of the transition. It's also worth recognizing that challenge is also an opportunity. Certainly if we're talking about the opportunity to invest finance in sustainable and low carbon projects. So I mean, on this slide, just sort of 3 numbers that kind of show how the opportunity, what's the opportunity there in terms of investment and jobs for low carbon economy. Again, I mean, 180 US billion dollars annually from 2020 to 2030. In terms of adaptation finance, and $50 billion annually, so from developing countries. So again, a huge amount of finance needed to meet these targets. And then again, a number in the middle around $26 trillion of economic benefit could be generated, and something like 65 million new low carbon jobs. So it's clearly an opportunity. And it was really heartening to hear yesterday that the Malaysian government looking through in their budget to bring in a green recovery element to that budget. And there clearly is an opportunity to drive economic benefit as well as reducing carbon emissions. Again, it shows opportunity. We know the cost of renewable energy will be consistently cheaper. It's getting cheaper and will continue to get cheaper. And some of you have seen that there came out of the IA this week. They're saying that solar power is now the cheapest electricity ever. So we know that renewable energy is currently low cost and is only going to get low cost. And again, that both provides an opportunity in terms of it being the most cost-effective solution for generating power, but it's also a challenge in terms of the impact that has on existing technologies, and also how you manage that transition of deploying renewable energy into the system. In Malaysia too, it's getting cheaper. So I mean, this shows the prices in the large-scale solar auctions in Malaysia. And so there have been 3 auctions, and you can just see that the cost of that has got cheaper as you've gone through, which is what you would expect, which is what you would expect, and is also again the purpose of the way the large-scale solar auction has been devised in Malaysia, is to kind of keep driving down that price. And that reflects what's happened in other countries that have similar schemes, where you've seen the price in the different phases get lower, go down. We sit on the other side looking at something, another way of looking at it. So you've got the expanding electric vehicle market. Again, I mean, Tesla is now the world's largest EV producer, and it's reckoned that by 2022 there'll be over 500 different EV models. And clearly there is a huge demand, or growing demand, and opportunity for electric vehicles. And even in Malaysia, so figure here, sort of an estimated about 100 units in 2013, and there's now about 52,000 units in March, as of March last year. So I mean that's a significant jump, but still only represents about 0.19% of the total vehicles registered in Malaysia. So again, that's a real opportunity in terms of the market, the potential market for electric vehicles in the future. And again, there are key challenges. The key challenge with electric vehicles is making sure you have the infrastructure, particularly the charging stations, and then a lack of awareness in terms of are customers happy and aware of the benefit of owning an electric vehicle and how they operate. But clearly, again, it's an opportunity both from renewable energy and electric vehicle context, in terms of the opportunity as we transition to a low carbon energy system. So now taking a different tack, and so looking at what I wanted to really focus on the presentation is looking at, again, particular instruments that can be used to finance the transition to a low carbon economy, and particularly focus on the bond market. We're doing quite a lot of work through the program on bonds, and you started off with sort of green bonds. As it says here, the first green bond was issued in 2007. And green bonds, I think, are relatively well known in the market. Certainly across ASEAN and in Malaysia, there have been a number of green bonds issued over the last few years. So green bonds are relatively well known, but you are now starting to see a range of other types of, let's call them labelled bonds in the market, all aimed at driving sustainable outcomes, be they specifically green outcomes or social outcomes. And I've listed there's sort of 5 at the moment, if you like, classes of bond, from the green and social and sustainable through to transition, and now what we have as sustainability linked bonds. And I'll talk a bit more about certainly transition and sustainability linked, which are relatively new products on the market in a moment. So just looking at what the difference is between those bonds. So excuse me, just moving something off my screen. The difference between those bonds. I mean, this is just an example. Sorry, excuse me. This shows you the different types of bond and their features and how they differ. So you've obviously got the green bond. Again, it's relatively well known what a green bond is about. So it's about raising proceeds to finance or refinance green projects. So relatively well known and understood in the market. You have a number of standards and principles around green bonds, all of which largely build off the ICMA principles that were issued in 2014. There is an ASEAN green bond standard, and there's also the climate bond standard. And although they're largely similar, they do differ in certain ways. You've then got social bonds, which again similar to green bonds, about raising finance for social projects. And again, there are a number of principles and guidelines to drive the development of the issuance of social bonds, like again driven by the ICMA principles, and then there's an ASEAN social bond standard as well. And then sustainability bonds, which is effectively a combination of green and social. There have been a number of sustainability bonds issued in the region. And then the two new ones, so sort of these transition bonds and sustainability linked bonds, where transition bonds is really aimed at helping carbon intensive sectors transition. So they may have projects that don't fulfill the definitions of what would be classified as a green bond, but it is helping that sector or that company or that industry to transition to a lower carbon activity, and therefore they can raise what is called a transition bond. I said I'll talk about that again in a moment. And then you've got sustainability linked bonds. This is where the bond is issued against the achievement of certain sustainability targets. Again, just while we're looking at that, looking at all the range, all the different types of activity that fall under sustainable finance. So it's interesting. So a lot of people initially think about green bonds, but as outlined, there are a range of other activities that all come under the heading of sustainable bonds, a number of which can be linked to financing climate change activities. So be that, say, green loans, green bonds. We talked about transition bonds. There's gender bonds, sustainability linked bonds, and blue bonds. So all around sort of sustainable fish stocks and water. So again, a whole range of different activities under sustainable finance, and a whole range of different products that are available to the market to fund particular projects. This shows the growth of sustainable bonds. Clearly, it's accelerated in the last few years, and again, unsurprisingly, sort of led and dominated by green bond issuances, but certainly, seen sustainable and social bonds in the last couple of years, and then sustainability linked bonds starting to appear relatively recently. And again, looking again a bit closer in terms of what does that look like in terms of how many have been issued in the region. So on the left there, that kind of shows the bonds issued across the ASEAN region, and again the number and then the volume. And so we've highlighted again, the volume of bonds that have been issued in Malaysia. So unsurprisingly, mostly focused on green bonds. And then interesting, looking at sort of how, in particular, the bond market in ASEAN compares to globally. As we said there, at the moment, when this analysis was done, green bonds in ASEAN made up about 0.32% of the ASEAN bond market, but globally, green bonds only made up 0.4% of the global bond market. So ASEAN isn't actually, so certainly by volume, is not doing as too badly in terms of the rest of the world. And then again, looked at the one on the bottom there, looks at again the number of different standards that exist, and again what has been used in ASEAN to issue those bonds. And not surprisingly, the ASEAN green bond standards are lead, and then say some of the other standards that have been issued again listed. And again, one of the challenges and opportunity or challenges when you're issuing bonds is just understanding which of the various different standards are the right one for you to issue against. And this slide here, this again just looks at the green bonds that have been issued in Malaysia for certain activities. Again, and a number of them in the renewable energy sector, and a few in the building sector. So now, kind of talk a little bit about the two sort of emerging classes of bond that I talked about. So this is sort of transition bonds and then sustainability linked bonds. So why the need for transition bonds? So again, if you're looking to transition the economy, at the very least meet the Paris targets, if not go towards something that looks more like net zero, clearly every sector will need to play a role in that. We'll need to transition away from high carbon to low carbon. Now, for some industries, that's quite hard in terms of they're very highly carbon intensive and don't necessarily have a very obvious or accessible low carbon solution available right now. But again, need finance to be able to transition to a lower carbon intensive activities. And that's the whole idea of transition bonds, is to try and provide that support to enable an industry that say could be identified as sort of relatively hard to transition, but to help them transition to a lower carbon intensive activity. And I think the bottom box there kind of highlights the challenge, say around the shipping company, that wanted to issue bonds for LNG. And it was determined that whilst the impact of the project wouldn't be aligned with the Paris Agreement, at the time it was the best technology available for the long-haul shipping industry. And so a lack of other alternatives. So the CBI, and again, some of you will know the Climate Bonds Initiative, who keep a database of climate bonds have been issued or green bonds have been issued. Again, they agreed that they would include that within their database because it kind of will say it was indication that, again, it was the only option at the time, or the best available option at the time for the shipping company. And then so what does a transition bond mean? At the moment, and again, unfortunately, within transition bonds, there isn't necessarily an internationally agreed standard like you have for green bonds under the ICMA. So, I mean, AXA, again, a number of you will know and come across AXA, that they've put out their transition bond guidelines that attempt to try and give some guidance as to what could be considered as an eligible project under for a transition bond. As they outline there is the guidelines, some of the guidelines they put out in relation to the kind of technologies that could be supported by a transition bond. So across the energy, sort of the transportation and the industry sector. And then looking again, so moving on to again, we have actually seen some transition bonds issued, and I've got a couple of examples of these here, which will probably again help provide some sense of what transition bonds are. So this is one that was issued by Capco, and it was about, say, energy, some energy transition finance, to say that looking to help Capco transition and invest in finance some of its climate actions. And again, what they look to do, again, given the absence of a formal structure or framework for transition bonds, they align this to what's known to the GBP, to the ICMA standard. So the framework they developed to deliver that transition bond was aligned to the GBP. And again, that is one really good way of, when you're looking at transition bonds, is looking at the sort of the frameworks that exists for other bond classes and how that can be used for a transition bond. And again, this goes in a little bit more detail about Capco in terms of the bond. And so what they're looking to try and do is avoid 1 to 2 million tons of CO2 and have a lower emissions intensity. And as with other bonds, they had the assurance process that's really important, so that investors really get really clear that the bond is doing what it's supposed to be doing. And then another one, Caden Gas, which is a UK company which owns the gas distribution network. And again, they were looking to get some finance to do some retrofitting across their gas network. And again, it wouldn't classify as a purely green bond. So they developed a framework for this transition bond, and so include within that had a process for both identifying the projects, managing those proceeds, and then for reporting. Again, it's the reporting external review that becomes really important in terms of being really clear that the proceeds which the bond have been issued are being spent on the relevant projects, and there is a robust reporting framework for that. And then turning on to what we call sustainability linked bonds, again a relatively new class of bonds, and this is where it's looking to actually, rather than fund a specific project, but the bond is linked to the achievement of certain sustainability linked outcomes, and that may say, if you meet the target, if you miss the target you set for the sustainability target, again you're penalised in terms of the bond rate. Now, there is, unlike with transition bonds, there are now some principles that are largely internationally recognised principles, which is, again, the ICMA have put out some principles which are now kind of being followed by those people looking to issue a sustainability linked bonds. And say broadly that the process is similar to how you would issue any other bond, with two additions, and these are which is 1 and 2 here, which is where you have you have to set key performance indicators. So and then the sustainability targets. So what are the sustainability targets that you're looking to meet as a result of issuing the sustainability linked bonds? And then again, once you've agreed on those, again the bond is then, say, the process of issuance is similar, and then you have the annual reporting and the verification as you would with another bond. And then just an example of that, again, which again I think probably explains it a little bit more. And then this is the one that most people talk about when we talk about sustainability linked bonds, and that's NL. So as it says there, NL issued what was considered was a sustainability linked bond, although they published it before, they issued it before the guidelines and the principles came out, but they issued a 1.5 billion bond with a 2.6% bond coupon, and it was the KPIs were around renewable energy installed capacity. So they were basically committing to increasing the percentage of their renewable installed capacity. And as I indicated here, they were looking to have 55% of their installed capacity renewable energy by 2021, up from 46% in 2019. And then the bond coupon rate would increase by 25 basis points if the goal was not reached. So that's the incentive, if you like, or that's the way that the difference with the sustainability bonds is, say, if you don't achieve the target, then you'll get penalised by an increase in the coupon rate. And say this is one of the most well known and one of the most well talked about, which is the NL sustainability linked bonds. There have been others, including ones that have been issued in this region in Malaysia. So we listed the two there. So CIMB have done an SDG bond. And HSBC Amana have done an SDG Sukuk, basically looking to fund for SDGs. I mean, broadly, the sustainability linked bonds have been introduced to drive finance for SDGs, which obviously cover 17 different areas, and so are broader than just environment or green or climate. So the SDGs are a much broader set of metrics, and again, the sustainability linked bond have been introduced to largely help entities raise finance to help them meet their SDGs. And so there've been two in Malaysia, and we've picked up two again that have been issued in Singapore. So they've been raised against a number of ESG metrics. And I think, again, as there is now increasing focus on sustainable finance, as opposed just to green finance or climate finance, and a focus on ESG and SDGs, we're going to see a demand and interest in these additional, say, bond classes, so sustainable linked bonds, instance, or transition bonds, as we say, start to see this focus on both, say, climate finance, and DG finance. So that's the end of my presentation. I hope you have found that useful. Obviously, happy to address some questions now, but also after the event, I'm happy to do some follow up on a one-to-one basis if you have any questions about anything I have talked about, or the work of the program that we're running on behalf of the UK government more broadly. So thanks for your your attention and say looking forward to some of the questions.
Thank you, Mr. Russell. Wow, a lot of information on the latest development related to the sustainable finance. So now we go to the Q&A session. So we have Jonathan still with us. I think Jonathan take a call from Washington. So I have one question for Mr. Jonathan. Mr. Jonathan, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Oh, and there I am.
Ah, now we can see you. We can see your smile here now.
Good.
Okay, Mr. Jonathan, you're talking about the government strategy, long-term strategy in achieving the NDC. So since the latest, the issue on the pandemic, so the government priority currently, they want to focus on the green recovery, or they want to make sure people have something to eat. So my question here is how the pandemic affect the government strategy in achieving the Paris Agreement, since the current priority is to reboot the economy. So any thought?
Well, it's an excellent question, and countries around the world are struggling with this, as are economic institutions like the World Bank. And the short answer is you need to build back better. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity of fiscal stimulus. In 2008, of course, we had the financial crisis. I've seen estimates that the fiscal spending will be 3 times what we saw in 2008 and 2009. So you need to build back better. Unfortunately, based on the analysis that I've seen of the recovery plans of the major economies, they're not really taking that into account. It's business as usual. So that's really, really unfortunate. You can try to do it. There have been a lot of analyses showing that green spending is better for jobs, because in many cases, brown spending, if you will, or business as usual, imports fossil fuels, you send your money abroad. But if you can manufacture renewable energy domestically, for example, there's a much better opportunity to build back better. Because once this fiscal stimulus is done, it's really going to tighten the fiscal windows or restrict the ability of governments in the years to come. There's going to be a lot of deficits around the world. So you're really not going to be able to do this again and again and again, which kind of goes to the point of our report and what I tried to convey in the presentation, that you have to be very catalytic with the limited amount of money that you're going to spend. So in the short term, you build back better, and there are many good opportunities there. But going forward, the public financing is just not going to be there. There's only so much deficit spending governments can do. So you've got to be very selective and catalytic with the public money that you spend.
Thanks, Mr. Jonathan. So my next question to Mr. Russell, you mentioned about different type of sustainable finance. So again, the question, why, for instance, the sovereign issuance, why they want to go for green bond or green sukuk, for instance? Why not they go for normal bond?
Yeah, that's a really good question. When we get asked a lot. But I think if you look at, we know where we're going as a global economy. So there is much more focus on both reducing carbon emissions, so the low carbon energy transition, and on SDGs more broadly. So we're going to see the demand for instruments that actually finance those activities increasing. And we know that there is a large amount of capital looking to invest in sustainable projects, be they low carbon or broader sustainable projects. But challenging for them is to find those projects. And so obviously being able to invest in a labeled green or sustainable bond is a really good way for an investor to be able to make that investment. So in our view, right now, it's really hard to say, yes, there is a definite financial benefit from issuing a green bond. The numbers aren't there yet to show that actually you get a financial benefit from issuing a green bond. You certainly don't get a financial disbenefit from doing it, but we also know from the experience we've seen is that what happens is for green bond issuers is they start to get in access to a whole range of different investors they haven't seen before. So they're investors who say are looking particularly for green or sustainable investments and are looking for places to put their money. And again, a labeled bond can be a way of doing that. And so we think that actually there are lots of reasons for doing it now, because if you're a company or an organization that has experience of issuing bonds, that get you ahead of the pack and able to respond to the market demand, which we believe will only get greater going forward.
So based on your experience, Russell, in ASEAN countries, So why do you think Malaysia should issue a sovereign green bond?
So what a sovereign green bond can do, and it can do two things. The first thing, it can really send a signal to the market that the country is serious about green finance. So the government saying, yeah, we're prepared to issue a sovereign green bond, so it can help send that signal and help bring the market along in terms of understanding that. And then the second thing, obviously, is as other countries have done, other countries have really have climate action plans they're looking to deliver, which cost money, and so you actually can use a sovereign green bond to finance a lot of the activities you're looking to do through in terms of climate change in particular. And so what a sovereign green bond can do is give you access to a whole range of additional capital to help you meet those targets. Again, send a strong signal to the market and to the community more broadly that you're serious about meeting those targets and really looking to attract the finance to deliver, say in this case, deliver against a low carbon target.
Oh, great. Mr. Jonathan, feel free if you want to answer any questions. Or you want me? Okay, I have another question for you because you share a little bit about the green technology. So one of the concerns from the policymaker, they say if they want to go for clean technology, so the cost is slightly expensive compared to the conventional normal. So what do you think about this? What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm a big proponent of technology innovation. Very often it's impossible to do an apples to apples comparison of the new, cleaner, more efficient technology to the incumbent browner technology. And a lot of the barriers, so that's not really the barriers. I'm going to do this, it costs $10. I'm going to do this, it costs $9. It's difficult to do apples to apples because the real challenge is integrating the new technology within an existing system. I mentioned in my presentation the challenge of introducing renewable energy to a utility grid that's built based on the model of large centralized fossil fuel plants. So even though solar power prices have fallen so much, the uptake of it is not, it's a lot, but it's not quite as much as one would have expected based on the fact that integrating it into the existing system is very difficult. But I think you mentioned before in a previous job I led a program called the Climate Technology Program, which was all about innovation. And what we focused on was a major barrier, which was local capacity for technology implementation, not development. The big countries of the world will still do the R&D, the lab research, getting the big prototypes out there. But how do you apply it to developing countries? And within that group, of course, you have wildly diverse conditions. So it's not, as I said, a question of apples to apples comparison, but I'm a very big fan of taking the available international public money that's available and building local capacity to adapt and implement the technology innovation. Because the fact is, if we are just dealing with the technologies we have today, I'm not sure we can address climate change, to be honest with you. I don't think there's enough incremental money to do that. That's not the official view of the World Bank, and people dispute that, but we need to support technology and that crucial last step of capacity in the countries where it will be implemented. I think that's a great use of public money.
Russell, any thought?
Yeah, I would fully agree with that. And I think certainly with renewable energy is no longer an economic issue. We know that the cost of renewable energy, be that solar or wind, is, if not as cost effective as more traditional technologies, is cheaper. But the issue then is integration. And I think, if you look at, as I said, I have experience in Australia, what's happening in Australia, the market is choosing to build renewable energy because they know for them, it's the cheapest form of renewable. They don't want to build coal, they don't want to build gas. The market is choosing to build renewable energy. The issue has become a regulatory problem in terms of getting access to the grid and the grid being able to operate in the right way to allow all of that renewable energy to go onto the grid. And it's now becoming much more of a technology integration regulatory problem as opposed to purely an economics problem. I think we probably are now over the point where economics is the issue. It's much more now about how do you regulate the market to allow those new technologies which operate in a very different way to the traditional technologies, how do you operate the market to allow them to come into the market and deliver the benefits, which is both low carbon energy, but also cheaper power to the population?
So there is one question: what can government, federal or state, do to further incentivize the uptake of renewable energy and climate positive project? I think both of you can answer this. Maybe we can start with Russell first.
Sure. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Again, I mean, I think not, as I just said, in terms of economics, it's no longer an economic issue. It's much more about a direction of travel. And what you've seen across countries across the world now is a lot of them adopting very, kind of very deep climate change or emission reduction targets. I mean, people talk about net zero. So I mean, the UK has got a net zero target. A number of other countries have net zero targets. And obviously what that does, it then means that to achieve that level of target, you have to, every part of your infrastructure will need to change. And so that really drives the incentive to say, okay, if I'm building a piece of infrastructure today that's going to be around in 2050, it has to be aligned with a net zero target. And so it's about thinking about, can the government really send a signal to the market that low carbon is important and what they want to see happening across the economy, and so set those kind of targets. I mean, say in the UK they have a legal framework that now it's a legal requirement to meet that net zero target, and that does a lot to focus the minds across governments. Because one of the things about sustainable finance is it's not just about finance; it's actually about the projects that finance is going to support. You need to have all of the bits of government, whether they are the ministries of finance, whether they're the financial regulators, or whether it's the energy department developing renewable energy or energy efficiency policy, your housing department for its housing policy. Across the government, you need all of the government departments to be aligned in looking to achieve a particular target, and then the market will then follow that signal and say, okay, now we understand that you have this long-term target for emission reduction. We can now look where we can put our finance to support those initiatives.
Jonathan, any thought? I think you mute, Jonathan.
No, Russell is spot on. I have nothing to add. It's not really an economic issue. It's the other stuff. But I did see another question in the chat there about how Malaysia can attract more sustainable finance. And I just wanted to make the point that, this is an evolving field right now. And I say that in regard to the term sustainable finance, which really has many different definitions. And I alluded to that a little bit in my presentation. You can try and get money from the GCF, for example, which is good money to get because it's very low cost. Or you get MDB money, or you get private money that would invest in these green bonds. But as Russell pointed out, that private money isn't going to take a lower rate of return on the green bond. So it's still valuable. So the taxonomy of sustainable finance, green finance, climate finance, all of these terms needs to be sorted out, and government and private sector actors need to get a handle on that to say, okay, we're going to take this limited amount of free money we have, highly concessional money, but let's not spend it on renewable energy, which doesn't need it. We're going to spend it on changing the regulations that would then give more more public finance, which would then in turn lead to the holy grail, which is private finance. So you really need to break down sustainable finance into these different categorizations and deploy it accordingly, because it's really quite different sources of finance.
I think there's one more question, because I think, to be fair to Jonathan, because you take a call from Washington, so maybe we'll end before 11. So there's one question on a green investment bank. So you want to answer, Jonathan or Russell? Maybe you can start first. Yeah.
Let me just say that I actually don't know that much about it. We're doing some work at the World Bank looking at green investment banks. It seems to make all the sense in the world because you have a nice public-private partnership. I'm working on a few countries where they're setting up a green investment facility. So I think it's a good idea. I can't say for sure that Malaysia should follow. I don't know the conditions that much in Southeast Asia or the Mongolian case, but it does seem to offer a nice way to combine and channel money in this kind of coordinated fashion that I've been advocating.
Russell?
Yeah, happy to comment. I prefer the term that Jonathan used, which is a green investment facility, as opposed to a green investment bank. You go and talk to you go into a country and talk about a green investment bank, and the banking regulator gets very nervous, because obviously that means, are you creating a new bank? In which case, there's a whole load of regulation around a bank operating. And we know in some countries in this region, they don't want another bank to be in the market. So I think we just need to be clear about, again, the language we use. So certainly, there are advantages to having a dedicated public green investment or facility that helps facilitate the country getting access to all of the different bits of money that are available, whether that be, say, GCF or other public MDB money, or helping to support private sector money coming in, or even the Green Investment Bank, the UK had, obviously was investing government money in private projects, and they did that to stimulate the market, and in particular the market for renewable energy, and primarily for offshore wind, where at the time they established it, the private sector was a bit nervous about investing in offshore wind, so the government effectively set up the Green Investment Bank to do a number of things, and in particular to help support the emerging offshore wind industry. So I think there is certainly a role for Malaysia to think about. Does it need this kind of facility that can actually help Malaysia get access to all the different bits of finance that are available, and potentially look at, are there some gaps in the market where private banks are potentially not able to enter, or nervous about it, and can the Green Investment Bank, which say you spending government money, help fill that gap? And they talk about crowding in, so it doesn't invest only in the project, it takes a position in the project and helps bring in other banks. There's examples again in other countries. Australia has one too, where it's been really successful at crowding in private investment, because obviously a bank is a bit happy with the risk of a project if the government is also behind it. So I think there's certainly value in Malaysia looking at whether there is a role for a dedicated green or finance facility to help leverage and access a whole range of different pots of money, and potentially provide public finance for some of the large emerging renewable energy projects coming through.
Thanks. I think we answered most of the questions. So maybe 1 minute, your key message. We start with Russell and then Jonathan. Then we can end our session.
So yeah, so my key message would be, first, or two. I probably have three key messages. One is financing low carbon is not a money problem. It's about the projects. There's plenty of money looking to invest, and it's just about finding those issues. The second one is around, it's not just a finance issue. As you're talking about financing, sustainable finance or climate finance, you need to bring together both the finance and the project. So in terms of government thinking about it, you need to make sure it's not just your finance department or your finance regulators or your central banks thinking about it. They're actually working alongside those government departments that effectively have the pipeline of projects. And then the third one is setting a really clear direction of travel. So if it's really clear to the market that there is a direction of travel, you can see where you're trying to get to, the market will come in and find solutions, and the money will flow to the projects that it will want to invest in.
Jonathan, your key message?
Well, I second Russell's messages, all of which I think are spot on based on my experience. There is money out there to get, public, MDB, private money, and you need to do the things that Russell's talking about. The theme of the day is transformation. Nobody wants to invest in a project that's just a project. You want to show and you need to demonstrate how you're going to have a catalytic effect going beyond your project boundaries. And another thing we didn't talk about that much, but I didn't want to raise as sort of a final message, is this notion of a just transition. As we transition to a clean economy, we do the clean energy or the climate transition, there's going to be winners and there's going to be losers. If you're working at a coal plant or a coal mine, I mean, that's just not fair at all. Your livelihood is going down, and whole communities can be decimated because of that. So it's important that some money be spent, even concessional money. There's no real return in it to take into account the losses suffered by certain individuals and certain groups, and to compensate them with training or whatever it is, because we're talking about a transformation economy-wide, profound, important, and so forth and so on. There's going to be losers, so you have to spend money to take those people into account.
Thanks, Jonathan. So I think most of the countries currently, they are focused rebooting their economy after the pandemic. So they should prioritize, meaning green recovery also will give a long-term benefits. Okay, thanks again to all the speakers. I think with that, I pass the session back to Elena. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your attention and active participation during the Q&A. Before you go, please be reminded that our Financing Climate Action Conference will continue at 3 p.m. today, where we will delve into green bonds and green investment with a panel of experts from Malaysia and the UK. Please join us then. While you wait, may I invite you to virtually visit the iGEM Expo Hall, where you will find innovative green technology and inventive eco products. See you at 3 p.m. Thank you.